Well, we had a long discussion about this at the G20 leaders meeting in Toronto and a week or two before with finance ministers in Busan in Korea. There's no doubt that the downside risks arising, if you like, from uncertainty about sovereign debt issues in Europe, the financial system in European countries and so on, do weigh very heavily on sentiment, and they've certainly had a dramatic impact on markets. But if you talk to many of the leading economists and policymakers, what you find is that there is an optimism also about the Asia Pacific. And it's an optimism which can't exist entirely independently from the downside risks that flow from what's going on in Europe and to a lesser extent uncertainty about the United States. But the one thing I'm absolutely certain of is that growth in this region is going to remain strong, and it's going to be strong for some time to come. It's not immune from the fallout of what could occur if there were further events in the European financial system. But the scope for productivity growth in this region, population growth itself, and the relative health of the major economies in this region, China, India, and a number of others, suggests to me that growth in this region is going to be strong. And that is a very important factor when you're talking about the outlook for this country. We are now entering what we call resources boom Mark II. And with resources boom Mark II comes a very strong pipeline of investment. We've got a very good budget position. We are in the best possible position we could be, having avoided recession, to maximise the opportunities that flow from that growth. And I believe that growth will be there and it will be significant, and that means the outlook for this country is, I think, quite bright. Now, I know there are always a number of professional pessimists around who will say, well, all of that depends on the strength of China. Well, I think China will continue to grow relatively strongly for some time to come. I also believe that when you're talking about the Asia Pacific, it's not just a China story. It's an India story, it's an Indonesian story, it's a Malaysian story, it's a South Korean story, it's a Vietnamese story. It's a far bigger story than just China. But yes, if things were to go really bad in Europe, and yes, if there were dramatically unexpected events in China, they would impact dramatically on global growth, which would flow through to this region, including to this country. I don't think that is where we're going to end up. It's true the American consumer is not going to drive the global economy as they did prior to the global financial crisis, nor will the European consumer. But I think there is enough weight in this part of the world to take up that slack, and that's very good news for Australia.
I mean, you are in the delicate process, as are most European countries at the moment, and indeed America, of trying to withdraw the fiscal stimulus package. Where do you sit on the debate that's going on in Europe and America, the very important debate that's going on in Europe and America about austerity versus stimulus? And how do you feel that might have an impact on the Australian economy?
Well, as I said in my remarks before, we put in place our fiscal consolidation strategy back last year when we moved dramatically to stimulate our economy. We put out a set of fiscal rules which people didn't really look that closely at the time. As growth has returned to trend, we've applied those rules. Last year we said, when we moved to stimulate the economy, that when growth returned to trend, and it has, we would strictly apply those fiscal rules that I outlined before. A 2% expenditure cap. Now, when growth's growing at trend or above, that's a very significant constraint on your expenditure. In our last budget, we put in place the biggest fiscal consolidation we've seen in this country since the 1960s. And that has flowed directly from the application of the 2% cap, the banking of improved revenues, and so on, and offsetting new expenditure. So we're in the terrific position of coming back to surplus 3 years early. The decision that was taken at the G20's leaders meeting was for advanced economies to halve their deficits by 2013. We are coming back to surplus in 2013.
Can I just ask you to expand a little bit on that? Because, I mean, yes, surplus in 2 or 3 years is a laudable prospect, but what are the details, and what are some of the details of how you're going to bring the economy back into surplus? We've been listening to the debate about, obviously, the mining tax and the reduction of the mining tax. And I think there's some chicanery, a little bit of chicanery in and around the figures there. I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about how you plan to bring the...
Well, there's none of that at all. the budget is coming back to surplus because of the 2% cap, and we're banking all upward revisions of revenue. The revenue from the mineral resource rent tax is revenue that we are devoting exclusively to economic reform as we go forward. When we responded to the report of the independent review, we said any revenues raised would not go towards repair of the budget, because we had done that through the application of our fiscal rules. We recognise if we're going to cope with the challenges of mining boom Mark II, then we have to put in place a suite of policies which reform our economy and expand our capacity and lift our national savings. So with the $10.5 billion that will flow from the mining tax, we are cutting company taxation. We are giving additional tax cuts to small business to stimulate small business. We are investing it in boosting the superannuation savings of our workforce, particularly our lowest paid. And we are investing in infrastructure. If we are going to grow with resources boom Mark II, then what we have to do is invest in capacity. What has bedeviled this country in resources boom Mark I was we didn't have enough investment, particularly in critical economic infrastructure. The consequence of that was upward pressure on inflation and therefore upward pressure on rates. We're absolutely determined to put in place a broadly based reform program which gives incentive to business, which will attract foreign investment, which boosts our national savings and which invests in infrastructure.
There is a little bit of concern, if I might go back to the 10.5 billion though, that number is based on assumptions for commodity prices that were somewhat different in the economic statement that you released from the figures that you had in the budget. Do you feel that there's been a bit of
not at all
wishful thinking there on the prices? I mean,
not at
after all, the global economy is projected to slow a little bit.
Well, what you said about the assumptions isn't correct. Our assumptions for commodity prices are not built on an assumption they will stay at historical highs forever. Far from it. They are at historical highs now, but the forecasts have actually got them coming down over the medium term. We don't assume automatically in our forecasts that they stay at those historical highs forever. We do assume they come down. We have been very cautious in our forecasting. Indeed, one of the criticisms that have been made of this government by both the opposition and a number of market economists is that we've generally been too optimistic, when in fact we've always been very cautious. So there are many people who didn't accept the path that we laid out, the targets that we set ourselves, and generally we've exceeded them. So we've always been pretty cautious in our forecasts, and our commodity forecasts are very cautious. They're based on updated ABARE data, they're based on discussions with the companies, and they are also based on the outcomes of spot price negotiations.